Warramai, welcome. I'm Peter Shergold and I'm the Vice President of the Royal Society of New South Wales, and I'm very pleased to introduce this next session on the future of Australian democracy, on the threats to Australian democracy, of course, on the challenges to our structures of democratic governance, certainly, and on opportunities to reinvigorate or reimagine our understanding of democracy, hopefully. I think Christy Muir, who's the CEO of the Paul Ramsay Foundation, and I started to open out this discussion earlier in the year in April, when we had a conversation for the Royal Society on putting the civil back into civil society, the importance of the not-for-profit organisations that we were hearing about in the first session. And you can find that, as well as many other good Royal Society functions, up on YouTube. And then just a few days ago, one of our Royal Society fellows, Mark Evans, was part of a team that produced a new democratic audit of Australia's evolving democracy. It was published by LSE Press. It's well worth starting to look at. And I'm sure that he will present his findings to a future meeting of the Royal Society. And his well-balanced conclusion is that our long-established, solidly founded liberal democracies is not in crisis, well, exactly. He does say, they come to the conclusion that we're not now in the top 10 democratic countries over the last few decades. Our performance, they think, has been rather variable. There are signs of democratic malaise, and we need to find a way to renew ourselves and strengthen the protective power of democracy. So that, I think, democratic audit is a good foundation on which to base our session today. I pulled together a wonderful panel there. You're sitting there very nervously at the moment, thinking, how can they speak in 9 minutes and 30 seconds? Their biographies are in the programme. First, I'm going to get to talk to us Dr. Jeni Whalan, who is a distinguished academic turned influential public servant who headed the Commonwealth Government's Strengthening Democracy Taskforce. And I think her strengths as a political scientist and a public policy strategist, an author, a researcher, are evident in the report of that task force, which was published in July this year. And the good news is, if you are captured by what she says, and you will be, we have copies of that task force report for you to grab. Second, nearest to me, is Leila Smith, a Wiradjuri woman, a CEO of the Aurora Education Foundation, the Charlie Perkins Chevening Scholar, and chair of the America-Australia Association. And then third, between them, is Nick Bryant, who very modestly, I'd have to say, describes himself on his website as an author and journalist. In truth, as you probably know, Nick was for a long period one of the BBC's finest foreign correspondents, and then while he was in the United States, wrote When America Stopped Being Great, A History of the Present, which I think, Nick, for perhaps the next 2 months, will sit on the library of the Oval Office with President Biden. More recently, he completed The Forever War, America's Unending Conflict with Itself, and perhaps most pertinent today, he's also written The Rise and Fall of Australia, and I do recommend all 3 books. So now we're going to get a brief presentation from each. If there was time, I suspect, watching Peter Varghese' hopeless chairmanship of the last one, there will not be time to have a structured discussion from here, but we will then go straight to questions from the floor. So, Jeni, over to you.
Terrific. Hello, everyone. Thank you to the Royal Society for the invitation to come and speak to you today. Peter mentioned that I led the Australian Government's Strengthening Democracy Task Force in the Department of Home Affairs, which reported in July this year. I thought I might talk to you a bit about what that task force found. And that task force has now rolled into an office, the Office of Community Cohesion, which I also lead in Home Affairs. the task force was set up in early 2023 by then Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill, who was troubled by the democratic backsliding that we were seeing around the world, and was troubled by a range of other challenges to democracy that were being felt here at home, and particularly in her portfolio in the national security space, challenges like foreign interference, challenges like violent extremism, but also a more pervasive sense of people's disconnection and disengagement from institutions. And we were asked as a task force to understand what the evidence around the world looked like, what the evidence here in Australia looked like, but then to be ruthlessly practical, not perhaps to start with Greek democracy, but to look hard at what we can learn from democracies around the world, what the state of play here in Australia was, and crucially, what could be done practically to strengthen Australian democracy in what feels like a more difficult time. And so that's what the report lays out. We set out 5 ideas, and I just want to walk through those 5 ideas just now. The first idea is that democracy is a national asset that's worth protecting. Now, I hope that when we say that out loud, that seems self-evident. But of course, until we say it out loud, it's perhaps not. In Australia, I think we've had a privilege of complacency about our democracy for many decades, and that's a terrific thing. We should be able, to some extent, to have as secure and robust and resilient a democracy that we can afford to take it for granted. But that time is past, and we're faced by a range of new challenges. We need to get more explicit about the contributions of our democracy to our society, and that goes not just for government, not just for the federal government, for governments of all levels, but for all of our institutions, non-governmental as well, across society. The second idea is that we can draw confidence in this task from Australia's long histories of creativity and ingenuity, often world-leading innovation and reform in our democracy. That's true through our modern democracy in our distinctive electoral institutions. In many respects, Australia has not only led the world but been the envy of the world for the strength and robustness of its electoral institutions, its pioneering use of the secret ballot, the extent to which our independent and professional electoral commissions make this the easiest place in the world to vote, the extent to which our electoral commissions are independent in the first place. These are tremendous strengths, and not least our compulsory voting and our systems of preferential voting. It's also true, these long traditions of democratic innovation and ingenuity in things like the integrity reforms which characterised the 1970s and 80s, in our incredibly vibrant and active civil society, about which we've heard some today. That is, Australian democracy has never stood still. The stewards of Australian democracy have never let it stand still. Every generation has risen to the challenge of protecting and nurturing our Australian democracy, and that's the task for us today. The third idea is that we needed a strengthening democracy task force, not because Australian democracy is fundamentally weak. In fact, the third idea is that Australian democracy is strong, but it's vulnerable. It's vulnerable to a range of shared challenges facing liberal democracies around the world. We heard a little bit in the previous panel about measures of trust and satisfaction, whether with democracy or government in different forms. One of the things I think important to keep in mind that global comparison helps us with is that Australians value our democracy more highly than is common in liberal democracies around the world. Australians overwhelmingly think it's important, and in fact, majority think it's very important to live in a country governed democratically. But about 1 in 2 are concerned about the trajectory, the direction of travel for democracy. They're concerned about a range of things. They're concerned about the rise of mis and disinformation in our environment. They're concerned about foreign interference. They're also concerned about all the processes of governing and governments that we've heard so much about this morning. But here's the kicker. 80%, thereabouts, of Australians think it's worth doing something to fix the problems we might face. Now, that's a tremendous reform constituency. That's a tremendous strength, again, that many democracies around the world would envy. We see anti-democratic sentiment very low in this country, and I think it's important to recognise the strengths in our democracy so that we can protect and safeguard them. Because the fourth idea of the Taskforce's report is that Australian democracy is facing a new constellation of challenges. And I say constellation because it's not the effect of any one of these challenges, or in the framing of today, the threats, but the way in which they interact. We name them in the report. They are from foreign interference, they're from rising mis and disinformation, they're from the role of social media and digital platforms, often interacting with those first two, increasingly the role of opaque algorithms and AI, dynamics of polarisation and division, of prejudice, hate, discrimination, of inequality, and then finally, perhaps the through line through all of those, dissatisfaction and distrust in governments and processes of governing. So if that's the fourth idea, what do we do about it? And this is the heart of the report. The fifth idea is that there are very many things, not only that we can do about it, but in fact, many around this country are already doing on a daily basis to strengthen democracy, and in fact around the world. So if we look at those challenges to democracy, the report sets out the way in which they come together to challenge three enduring strengths of Australian democracy. Trusted institutions. I would say we've heard a lot about institutions this morning. The second, credible information. I don't think we've heard that much about information. And the third, social inclusion. We've started to hear a little about that today, but I think the interplay of institutions, information and inclusion is a crucial place for us. So the report says there's really three things a practical agenda to strengthen democracy should do. First, it should protect our strengths. Act from a position of strength. Don't wait until we have a burning platform or democracy is on fire. Strengths like our electoral institutions, strengths like our information integrity, our free and open media environment, our citizens' engagement with the values and principles of democracy. The second thing though, strengthen that. Strengthen people's civic engagement, their understanding of democracy, not perhaps in necessarily the academic sense or the theoretical sense that we've heard a lot today, but in our everyday sense. What are your rights and obligations under a democracy? What does democracy give you? What are your duties to participate? Where are your opportunities to participate in democracy? And how are you connecting with others in your community and across communities in our democracy? And then the third, and I'll end here, is embrace democratic experimentation and innovation. We have a long history of doing that in our modern democracy. We're learning much more about the very long histories of governance in our First Nations history. And we need to embrace the experimentation and democratic innovation. That is why Australian democracy has the strengths it has today. So let me leave it there, Peter.
9 minutes, 41 seconds.
Are you timing us, Peter?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. All right, pressure's on.
Stare.
Firstly, it's so wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. It's a really busy time of year for us all, but even, doing the walk up to the drive to come here and in this stunning room and hearing all of the different perspectives and similar themes but different ideas has been really inspiring. So thank you so much for having me. As Peter said, my name is Leila Smith. I'm a Wiradjuri woman. So my family is from central west New South Wales. There's a small Aboriginal mission on the outskirts of Cowra called Arambi Mission. I'm not sure if anyone knows of it. My father grew up there and my grandmother and her mother grew up there as well. I think it's a really important place to start because democracy is about having a voice. And if we want to talk about control and being voiceless, growing up, my grandmother, her whole life was controlled. She had to get the mission manager's permission if she wanted to leave, if she wanted visitors. Her house was inspected regularly. This was absolute control. And we heard a lot about social inequality and the changes over that. Well, imagine fast forwarding to 10 years later and me sitting in a classroom, my first class at Cambridge University. That speed of social change. When I arrived at Cambridge in 2013, I was the second Aboriginal student to study there. One other Aboriginal student, Lily Brown, had been there before me, and she had graduated just 3 months earlier. I mean, this is a really compelling, amazing institution, a bubble that is dripping in privilege. And so when I arrived there and started thinking about our history, our tens of thousands of years of history, and realising that this was something that we hadn't had the opportunity to be part of. We heard earlier about economics of equality of opportunity. To think these universities have been around for hundreds of years, and this was a new experience to us, it was a very frustrating feeling. And it's something, a theme and a sentiment that we're hearing today about people feeling locked out and left behind as well. You know, I think it really highlighted for me these two worlds, more than two worlds, worlds apart that we were having. That was 10 years ago. We've now had nearly 100 Aboriginal scholars go to the top international universities, 100% completion rate. These are mostly scholarship recipient students that Aurora Education Foundation administers scholarships for. I'm the CEO of Aurora Education Foundation, so I've come full circle as a scholarship recipient to running the organisation. 10 years later, I get to do the call where I call the scholarship recipients and tell them, guess what, you're going to Oxford. It's the best part of the job. And I called this one scholar that's going over to Oxford, she's there now, Marlon. And Marlon's from the Tiwi Islands. And I called Marlon, I said, guess what, Marlon, you got the scholarship, you're on a Perkins scholarship to go to Oxford. And she started crying, and she told me this story that I'm going to share with you now, that she told this old uncle in the Tiwi Islands that she was going to Oxford. And he started crying. And he said, I never thought I would live to see the day that one of our people would go there. And she said, Uncle, it's not just me. There's a whole mob of us over there. And he burst into tears. Why is it that Aboriginal, this was 10 years ago we've had people going there. These are opportunities that are compelling, that are strengths-based. Why don't more people know about it? This is this narrative that we're talking about. There is social change happening. There are good things happening. How do we capture people's attention in this world where people are absorbing news and information in so many different ways, in a world where attention spans are shorter than ever? And this is something that we really tackled and thought about on the task force that Jeni talked about. I was an expert advisor on that task force. And I'm also the chair of the American Australian Association as well. 2 weeks ago, I was at a benefit dinner in New York. It was a week before the election. You want to talk about the Cambridge bubble? Well, New York is a bubble as well. We're sitting there in this Wall Street, Cipriani's on Wall Street, this massive fundraising gala, and everyone was saying it's going to be a close election. Kamala might get over, but it's going to be tight. And then there was somebody sitting next to me at the dinner, and he owns factories all around the US, Detroit, Dallas. And I said to him, what do you think is going to happen? And he said, Trump by a mile. I said, what makes you think that? He said, because I've spoken to my factory workers and they're all voting for him. How can we have these bubbles where everyone, not everyone else, but a lot of people at that gala was so sure that it was going to be close, and have this whole other world where they were so sure that it was not going to be close? And that's something that I spend a lot of my time thinking about. How do we bring worlds together? How do we bridge worlds, and generationally too? And so taking that to the theme today, which is about challenges to our democracy, I want to think about challenges to implementing change to strengthen our democracy. And another world that we need to bring together, which we've heard about today, is the generational shift that is happening. We need to engage young people earlier. I am guilty of this as well, I have to say. I'm the first to put my hand up. Sometimes by the time I engage young people in the design of something big, I do it later on. I leave it too late, and I don't think I'm alone in that. If we are going to be implementing any initiatives around democracy, we need to bring young people in earlier and earlier. We're getting better at it, but we still have a long way to go. The second thing, which we have also touched on, thank you, Peter, for mentioning the importance of leveraging partners outside government, thinking about NFPs at the regional and the national level to achieve democracy goals as well. So we heard, for example, in the Taskforce report, that participation in volunteerism, participation in sporting teams, in political parties, in unions is declining. So how do we engage people outside government when those rates are getting less and less? I think we need to look the next layer down and look at where the growth is happening. Women's sport, sure, overall team sports might be declining, but let's take a look at women's football. Let's take a look at AFL. There are other areas of growth which we can tap into, and I think looking outside government is really important to that as well. I'm going to put one other thing on the table, which is I wonder if we also need to spend more time acknowledging the power of public-private partnerships to achieve goals. Corporates across the world are getting increasingly on board with ESG and long-term commitments to education, for example, is something that I see all the time. There is a role here for democracy work too. I don't know what it is yet, but I still think this is an important conversation for us to have. This is not just about everyday participants of society. It's not just about the philanthropic sector. It's not just about the community sector. It's about corporates. It's about everyone, and that's what we've been hearing here today as well. But in conclusion, Peter, I know you're timing me, biggest challenge is timing. We need to act now. Once people start to feel they are left behind, they disengage, they don't speak up, our communities become fragmented, and that's when discord, ignorance, and even hatred happens. And at that moment, that hatred and intolerance and other sentiments like this start to crawl out from under their rock, that's when people start to think that others are less than. And then they don't even want to try to understand them because it doesn't really matter what they say. So the biggest challenge is acting now and making space to focus on strengthening our democracy, which is why I'm so thankful to be here today, and I'm so pleased to have this discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Here's the most nervous person in the room at the moment. Nick's thinking, how am I going to compete with these previous two speakers?
Thank you very much, Peter. It's very generous of you to mention that my book was in the Oval Office. I was rather hoping that having passed the torch to Kamala Harris, Joe Biden would pass the book to Kamala Harris as well. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. I've spent a lot of time talking this year. I've been talking about my new book. It's based on a simple premise. Donald Trump is as much a product of American history as Abraham Lincoln, as FDR, as John F. Kennedy, as Barack Obama, or Joe Biden. It's just a history that gets forgotten, it's a history that gets misremembered, and sometimes it's a history that gets deliberately buried and concealed. It's a history that defies the grand narrative of American history, one of progress and advancement. How tempting it was to think that America's first black president, Barack Obama, would be followed into office by America's first female president, Hillary Clinton. History doesn't work like that. And that lesson has been underscored over the past few days. I've spent most of the year talking. It has been fantastic this morning to spend it listening. And just a couple of reflections on what I've heard. Democracies work better when economies work better. If you look at the history of America over the last 50 years, political polarization tracks really closely with income polarization. There's a missing middle in American politics because there's a missing middle in the American economy. When I first went back to America in 2013, before Donald Trump came down that famous golden escalator, I was struck by how many people told me they no longer believed their kids would lead more abundant lives than they did. So when Donald Trump said the American dream is dead, so many people believed him. Bill Clinton had boasted at the end of the 1990s about building a bridge to the 21st century, but if you lived in the Rust Belt, it felt like a bypass. And those empty factories and those derelict steel mills became echo chambers for the words, "Make America Great Again." People really did feel like economic castaways in a globalized economy that they didn't understand and couldn't figure out how to make work for them. And I mention all that because when I returned to Australia 3 years ago, I heard people saying the same thing. I don't believe my kids will lead a more abundant life than I will. I don't believe that my kids will be able to afford a property, the essence of the Australian dream. Another thing worried me when I came back 3 years ago. It was in the midst of COVID. We were stuck in a quarantine hotel for 2 weeks. The first Saturday morning, we heard a muffled roar from the streets down below. It was an anti-lockdown protest of the kind I'd seen in America. And turning on the TV later that night, I saw that people were carrying ensigns and flags that I was more used to seeing in rural Michigan and Mississippi. They were Trump flags. One of them showed him portrayed as Rambo with an automatic gun in his muscly grip. And in Melbourne too, we saw a kind of grim Americanization. A gallows paraded through the streets, directed against dictator Dan, the moniker that was used increasingly by Rupert Murdoch's paper, the tabloid down there, which was starting to sound more shrill. It was starting to sound like its stablemate, Fox News. In a nod to the January the 6th insurrectionists, some of the protesters even urinated on the Shrine of Remembrance, Melbourne's most sacred site. Now, these anti-lockdown protests became a real cause célèbre for the American hard right. Candace Owens, who's a kind of blowhard on American cable, she said that America should invade Australia to liberate its people from the lockdowns. Tucker Carlson bemoaned the fact that John Howard had tightened up your gun laws so Australians couldn't take arms against their government. Ron DeSantis, who was the governor of Florida at the time, suggested cutting off diplomatic relations with Australia. Ted Cruz bemoaned the fact that a country he had always regarded as the Texas of the Pacific was being so draconian. And Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, tweeted in September of that year, "Don't Australia my America." And I found myself thinking the complete opposite. Don't America my Australia. Because it was not only street Trumpism that was evident, there was a small t Trumpism in Canberra as well. There was a post-truthism about the government of Scott Morrison. It worried me that the Liberals were trying to push through voter ID laws, which seemed right out of a kind of GOP playbook, a problem that the AEC said was vanishingly small. After Scott Morrison left office, we heard about the secretive multi-ministerial power grab that defied a democratic norm. During the Voice referendum, it worried me that Peter Dutton questioned the integrity of the vote, questioned the integrity of the AEC, which he suggested was trying to rig the vote. The AEC is the gold standard. It is something you should treasure. It is part of an Australian democratic model, which I hope will stand you in good stead right now. I plan to begin my remarks actually by talking about another Donald. Not Donald Trump, but Donald Horne. I loved his book, The Lucky Country. I read it in one gulp, flying from Sydney to Perth one day. It seemed to just so brilliantly encapsulate the land that I was traversing down below. And of course, Horne's book is remembered for that famous line, Australia is a lucky country led by second-rate people who share his luck. And here it's worth remembering the subtitle to The Lucky Country, Australia in the 1960s. I don't think that line really worked in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. Perhaps it did in the 21st century. I'm aware that Mike Baird is here right now. I said to Mike before coming on today, thank goodness during the time when you were changing prime ministers every 3 weeks and when the reform era was replaced by the retribution and revenge era, thank goodness the state governance was so strong. In many ways, Australia became Canberra-proof. But it was the next line that got to Donald Horne's thesis. Australia is a country that borrows ideas from other countries. It's a derivative country. It's an imitative country. It mimics other countries. And you just had to look at Canberra to see that for yourself. The nomenclature came from America, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Canberra looks like Westminster, you know, the green and leather benches. The Speaker's chair even had, in the old Parliament, even had wood from HMS Victory. But that's where I think Donald Horne got it wrong. Because Australia was actually brilliant at creating its own democratic model. Preferential voting. Compulsory voting. I left Australia vehemently opposed to compulsory voting. I came back after 8 years in America, an absolute advocate of it. It's definitely worth applauding compulsory voting because it is your great safeguard. And the other thing, weekend voting, this great celebration of democracy. You know, America has its elections on a Tuesday. Britain has it on a Thursday. America is one of the countries that literally tries to stop people from voting. It's great that you have this system where people have to go to the polls and it becomes such a great civic celebration. What I want to say today is stick with the democracy sausage. Don't go for the democracy hot dog. And whatever you do, don't America my Australia.
Well, that's great, and it does then give me an opportunity to start the discussion, and then I'll take questions or comments from the floor. And Jeni, I was just interested, as you were talking about the task force and what it was doing. Look, while you were doing it, was there anything that surprised you as you did this, or it was everything you expected?
I think I was surprised to some extent by the evidence of ongoing strength at a level that I hadn't quite expected. I think when we started the task force, I was a little more persuaded that things were a little more dire than, in fact, I think they are. I think the evidence doesn't wholly stand up to that, particularly when you take a look at all of the different dimensions and aspects of democracy. But the second is that it is a whole range of things that are crucial in a day-to-day and practical sense for democracy that democratic theory and the textbooks don't often tell us about. Things like the importance in this country of civic spaces like public libraries, which are incredible spaces that perhaps do better than most institutions at reflecting their specific communities. The difference between a public library in an area where I live, which is full of startups and side hustle folks on their laptops, and some other public libraries that I heard about, which are the only place that people can go to access the digital arms of government to check on their crucial government accounts or access the services to which they're entitled, to update their operating software on their phone using the data of libraries. Places like community libraries that had domestic violence survival kits because the library is a safe space to go and take the kids. There are also places staffed by librarians who are not only professionally qualified to navigate information, which is perhaps one of the most crucial skills of today in the challenges facing democracy, but also appear just instinctively afflicted with helpfulness. And if we need some spaces where people can come together across divisions, navigate credible information and get help to do it, public libraries are an amazing space. So that was some of the surprises, right? Stepping outside democratic theory and political philosophy to understand the place and the role of democracy in people's day-to-day lives.
Thank you, Jeni. I am so with you, by the way, on libraries. If you go around Australia and you can see this institution that people thought was going to die away 30 years now is now very often the centre of the civil community in places. Leila, I love the way you were balancing the sort of negatives and the positives. You come to sort of enhancing our democracy. Should we start with the weaknesses or strengths? What do you think is the best way to do it?
It's a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't have a simple answer, but I have gone on a journey through that answer. So when I started at Aurora about 5 years ago, it was really common in Indigenous affairs when you wanted to tell a narrative, particularly around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you talk about what's wrong. And you talk about what's wrong and how we need people's help to fix it. And us and a whole bunch of other organisations started to flip that narrative. And we wanted to talk about the strengths and why we needed people to work with us to build up those strengths. A lot like Jeni was talking about with the Taskforce work as well. And so we did that, and it was hugely successful. In the early days, there were a lot of people who said, you might not get as much money if you do this. You might not get as much funders, it might not be as successful, but it was more successful than we expected. And so then the referendum comes around, right? And people start thinking, let's start, when we're thinking about the vote coming up, it's about strength-based, it's about how this is going to help and all the things that are great. And one of our board members said to us after the failed referendum, you know, I think we might have gone too strength-based. I think maybe we spent so much time talking about how great things were that we didn't highlight the real issues that this would help. And I agree. I think maybe we just need to temper it a little bit, the strengths, but also the challenges. And I think the report does the Taskforce report does an excellent job of that as well. The media, of course, is playing a big role in this. There's crisis narratives get a lot of traction. One of our scholars, Perkins scholars, who's over at Oxford at the moment, is Brooke Boney from the Today Show. She's learnt so much about catering to mass mainstream audiences. Imagine if you can combine that with a Masters of Public Policy degree and combine policy and media. We need more people doing that to understand the art of a narrative. And one other example I'd like to give Peter, another role I have is on the UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Group. They pump out all these reports every year on the state of education globally. Heaps of reports, heaps of information. People's attention spans are dipping and dipping and dipping, so what do? They tried something new last year for the first time, where they got a comms specialist. The first report that they put out with the comms specialist was technology in education. And the journalist said, right, what you need to do is simplify this to UNESCO says ban mobiles in schools. It got the biggest traction that any UNESCO GEM report has ever had. They got meetings with really senior people in all of these countries, mass media uptake, but it completely missed the nuance in the report. It wasn't just about, or if at all about, banning mobiles in schools. So what do? Do you oversimplify for more traction? Or do you add nuance and get a different kind of audience? The jury is still out on whether they made the right decision or not, to be completely honest. So, Peter, my answer is I'm not sure, except maybe just temper it in the middle and keep an eye on the balance.
Thank you so much. Nick, you were so strong on keep the Australian democracy sausage. And I'm like you, I thought, I came here in 72, I thought compulsory voting was like the weirdest thing I had ever heard of, and now I'm a complete convert. When you talk about, though, preserve our strengths, what is it, though, that you think we should change in order to keep our democracy?
I think you need to tell yourself a different story about your democracy. I think you need to celebrate your democracy and reject that kind of lucky country thinking. I also think you need to reject mother country thinking, tyranny of distance thinking, cultural cringe thinking. I think so much of your intellectual architecture that has dominated post-war thought in Australia is now obsolete, and get away from it. You've made your own luck in many ways. You've come up with an economic model in the late 1990s that kind of works, and you've got a democratic model that works as well. And you weren't derivative on that. You took a system and you improved it. As Jeni was saying, there is a great tradition in this country of democratic innovation. Other countries borrowed your ideas. The AEC now is regarded as the gold standard. Tom Rogers, who's the head of the ACC, regularly gets asked by other countries with similar bodies, how do you do it? The same is true now of compulsory voting. Even American thinkers like E.J. Leon have started writing books called 100% Democracy. They don't call it compulsory voting because that phrase would never ever work in America. They call it universal voting. You know, people are looking to Australia, and I think Australians, you know, you've got this self-belittling streak when it comes to your national success. And I realise that there have been terrible national problems as well that Australia hasn't addressed as it should have. But there are a lot of good things about this country which could be exported, and the democratic model is something where you could become a global exemplar. You don't big yourself up enough on stuff like this, and I think you should. There is still this self-belittling streak. Again, it comes from lucky country thinking and a lot of other stuff. But, you know, Australia's got a great story to tell itself about its own democracy, and it's got a great story to tell the rest of the world about its democracy. I'm not a great fan of Australian politics, but I'm a big fan of Australian democracy.
That's great. Question?
I'm Sahili from Macquarie University. So my question is both either Jeni or Nick. So about the changes in global political trends like rise of populism or authoritarianism. So how these changes will shape Australian attitudes towards their own democracy, and are there any measures that Australia can adapt to counter this external influence to protect its own democracy? Yeah.
I think Nick highlighted really well the extent to which we can't only think about Australian democracy because the narratives about democracy flow across borders. And, you know, the extent to which we've talked already today about American democracy at length is one example of that. We found in our Taskforce work that globally the challenge to really watch out for was perhaps more precisely anti-institutionalism. Populism is often a political term that sort of can mean a whole range of different things, but the anti-institutionalism. And I think in answer to your second question, first of all, working out what it is that's distinctive about the strengths and the enduring strengths of trust in our institutions, as well as the challenges facing it. And then, you know, I'm just going to refer to Nick's excellent point as well. Tell better stories about Australian democracy. Don't only tell stories of democracy that come from the global domain. Tell better stories about the confidence and assurance of our own democracy and its distinctive features, which, you know, we've talked about at the electoral institutions. We can talk about things like support for multiculturalism. We can talk about things like sentiment about the role of government in our lives, just fundamentally different from some of these other contexts that we're talking about.
On the populism front, the great safeguard is compulsory voting. You know, it's the guard against polarisation. It means that politics gets conducted in the middle rather than the extremes. You know, obvious point. I also think that your self-belittling streak as a nation comes in handy, actually, in rejecting demagogues. I don't think Australia would cope with a demagogue because of the tall poppy syndrome, not least. You know, you like scything down leaders who have too grand an opinion of yourself, and I think that's a very useful safeguard right now. You know, when we've seen people like Clive Palmer and stuff, you know, they've tended to be regarded as sort of comical figures. What I worry about here is kind of Trumpism. Oh, sorry. It's very rare that anybody says I'm not projecting to a microphone. Oh, I see. Sorry. At the BBC, all I had to do was open the windows and point towards London, and people could hear me. The point about populism. What worries me more in Australia is, frankly, a kind of Trumpism without the charisma and the personal magnetism. That's kind of what I think. You're not going to get on a demagogic figure. You know, I've always said it would freak out people if their prime minister became a star turn at Davos. I think it would freak Australia out if their prime minister became a kind of, you know, a Trumpian figure. I don't think you're going to get that. What worries me is the kind of the nasty populist politics without the kind of charismatic personality that pulls it off. And that, for me, is the bigger threat.
I think those are really good points. I think one of the things I often notice that people somehow think our multicultural nature is a threat to democracy. Of course, a number of us here work with refugees and newcomers. What you discover over and over is they are not complacent about democracy. They will talk about it and are enthusiastic in those terms about Australia.
And often it's exactly the reason why they want to come here.
Yeah, I was speaking to a refugee from Pakistan just yesterday, and he told me he'd gone to Parliament House in Canberra, and he'd sat in on question time. And then he said, I was going to leave, but I went back the next day. And I said, well, what were they talking about? He said, I really don't know. But I was so impressed that you could sit that close to your politicians without restrictions and listen to what they were saying. And it brought that really across to me. Second question, just here.
Hello. My name is Dr. Erica Myers-Davis from the Royal Society of the Arts, Encouragement for Manufactures and Commerce, otherwise known as the RSA. For me, one of the elephants in the room talking about democracy is that governance and politics is actually pretty boring to the average person. And really, they don't really perhaps think that they're engaging with it, and when they do, it tends to be when things are going wrong. So things like being locked down during COVID, Scott having his extra little ministries, and things like that. So, and then when you've got the influence of figures like Trump, who often downplay traditional civic knowledge, I'm sort of reminded of the STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering, maths, and how they've successfully rebranded and made science really exciting. It's no longer for geeks and nerds, that all kids can engage. Is there, do you think, a need to do this with politics and governance to actually try to rebrand it? So one, we are teaching these subjects in school. We're making them really cool so that actually our young people and their parents want to engage and become active participants. Basically, how could we do this and rebrand?
Can I just jump in really quickly there? One of the phrases I really hate in modern day politics, and it's become a kind of rule, is if you're explaining, you're losing. It's so self-defeating. You've got to explain change. If you're explaining, you're ideally making things better. You're not losing. And another really depressing slogan, you know, in a politics that now is becoming so dominated by slogans, if you don't know, vote no, which was endorsing the idea of democratic illiteracy. Those two things are really problematic to me. We need to welcome the idea of explaining ourselves.
Leila?
Great question. This stuff is really, really tough. Being able to take a concept like democracy and describe what that looks like in an everyday world, in a day-to-day life on someone's kitchen table, it is really, really tough. So I think you have nailed one of our biggest challenges here. And I think we have to start locally is the best way to, I think we start bottom up. We've got, I feel like we've got a lot of the top-down work happening, but what we haven't, we've got some spurs of it happening, and it's great to hear about forums like this, but getting even more local and getting out into regions and places where forums like this might not happen, so that then those people who can't access amazing events like this can take it to their kitchen tables and starting with them as the audience. Remember how I said before, sometimes I think about young people as the last point? What if we started, how do we engage teenagers, which is what I love about your question, starting with a demographic that we've learnt this morning that we need to engage. What is topical for teenagers right now, and how do we engage them, not just through the schools, but also through the families, through the libraries, through the areas that they're engaging with. I'm not quite sure how, and I'll be the first to say it, but I think we need to start really drilling in on that. I think we've got a lot of background work to draw on, and we need to start there. If I can give one quick example that is very embarrassing. When I got the picture when I arrived at Cambridge and I sent it back to Cowra, I said I put it in a frame and I gave it to my nan, and at the same time my sister had got a job as a flight attendant at Emirates, and I came back to Cowra after the degree, and sitting on the mantelpiece was Simone, my little sister, in the bloody Emirates uniform, and where was I? I was saying, Nan, like, why is Simone up here and not me? And that communication barrier of what that could mean wasn't localised, it wasn't translated. That's how we get young people and different communities to understand what it means to them, is by translating, this is what this means for you. And I think schools can do that and community groups can do that as well. And so that's a very embarrassing story that I've just shared with you about my insecurities. But I think you've nailed it, the real tension point.
That's great. I love that story. I think civics is a deadening word. I know Mike Baird, who'll be here later, and with the Susan McKinnon Foundation, do a wonderful job in promoting democratic governance, but he will tell you this is true. When it came up at the board, I did say there were only 2 subjects I absolutely dreaded at school. One was sex education, and the second was civics. Your heart sank. What I think we have done, though, cleverly, actually, in the New South Wales schools curricula now, without ever saying the word civics or putting it in as a separate subject, we've really taken that idea and integrated into the curriculum right from kindergarten through to year 12. And I think that's a very effective way to do it. Next question. Yes, down here.
My question is particularly for Jeni. I noticed that there were 2 things that I think are an important source of lack of confidence in our government that didn't get a mention, at least in your spoken words. One of them is the lack of transparency and the quantity of lobbying that goes on that we have absolutely no visibility of. And the other is the issue of representation. Theoretically, we live in a representative democracy, but the reality is neither of the major political parties actually allows their members to represent the views of their community. And I think that is one of the core reasons for the success of the community independent movement. But I'd just like your comment on that observation.
On those 2 issues, Jeni, that's good.
Yeah, look, I couldn't disagree with either of them. I think the first is, in particular, one of the drivers of deteriorating public trust and satisfaction with governments and governing. So, to that extent, I think that is picked up well there. I think just to connect that to the previous question. And your mention of the sort of voices of movements and so on, the rise in examples of more forums for deliberation as part of representation. Often deliberative democracy is set up as some kind of opposition to representative democracy, and I think this country has all sorts of examples of making representative democracy more deliberative and more participatory. They need to be embraced at scale. We do highlight a whole range of those in the report. But to come back to the former question as well, driving the sort of supply of civics education or understanding of democracy and so on is one thing, but ensuring that, in your words, politics or the work of governing or the work of governments or perhaps the Canberra bubble is actually relevant to the daily lives of people, I think, is what's often picked up in the research around declining trust, right? I'd hate it if we paid so much more attention to things that are inside baseball in Canberra and not actually relevant to the small p politics of people's lives and the ways that they are engaged and contributing. So I think that's the kind of responsibility of promoting democracy beyond our governmental institutions, in our non-governmental institutions, in our communities, as in our everyday lives as citizens.
Just a quick few thoughts. One of the obvious biggest democratic trends right now is the decline of major parties. The rise of the teal or something similar is being played out in many democracies around the world. One thing that struck me about the teals is the quality of the candidates that they were fielding. When I was here the last time in Australia, and this is at the federal level, Mike, not at the state, it struck me that the best people were not always going into... The most impressive Australians I met weren't involved in politics. And the whole political process was off-putting for them, whether it was the pre-selection process or whether it was having to work through the labour machine, whether it was having to live in Canberra when you could live in Sydney or Melbourne. All these things were sort of not necessarily attracting the best people. If you wanted to change the world, you realise you could probably do it with an NGO, or you set up a startup in the digital world. There were other ways to do it. And I think attracting brilliant people into politics has become a problem. And I think the Teals have actually done it. I mean, I think most of the Teal MPs are really super impressive people. On the question of deliberative democracy, I mean, the problem for Australia right now, and we talk about this great tradition of democratic innovation, you missed the chance to have a democratic innovation with a voice referendum. And I think that has put that agenda off to one side now. You know, here was a chance to modernise your democracy. Here was a chance to listen more closely to First Nations people. Australia didn't take that opportunity. You know, that means that any kind of big democratic overhaul agenda is off limits now politically, and the same is true, alas, of the Republican agenda as well. I think, you know, it's going to take a very brave Prime Minister to go to the polls on the Republic. And I say this as a Brit who kind of has always been slightly mystified that you still have the monarchy. Getting the best people into politics is a key part of this. I think there is unquestionably an abundance of talent in Canberra right now. And there are really good people coming through, but that hasn't always been the case over the last 25 years.
Leila, if I can just follow that up. Is it a good thing now that we have Aboriginal politicians right across the political spectrum in Canberra?
It's not even really scratching the surface of enough, is what I would say. Yeah. It should be a footnote in the story, you know, of where we need to be. It's just, what we need is so much more than this. You know, we need there's priority reforms going through the APS, right through the bureaucracies, right up to, yes, political, on different ends of the political spectrum is one thing, but the numbers are so small that it only takes a couple of different people to heavily sway the nature and the values that are conveyed. It's far too easily tipped one way or the other. So I would say, look, it's never a bad thing, but it's so far from being nearly enough.
That's great. Thank you. I think I'm going to take one more question, and you can wait 3 minutes for lunch. Yeah.
Could the panel comment on citizens' assemblies?
Citizens assemblies. I'm going to ask one person actually on this one, Jeni, because I know you looked a lot in your report.
Well, I mean, I think the previous comments were really about that. Let me offer this as a comment. You know, and there are others in the room. I can see Ian from New Democracy over there, who you might want to have a chat to over lunch. Innovations in that form of deliberative forum are not new in this country. They're not new around the world. There's a lot of them going on in an increasingly diverse and influential fashion. I think Nick just gave you an account of what he thinks is the prospect for some of those, certainly at the national level. What might be relevant for this audience in particular is the extent to which Australian scholarship and practitioners on deliberative democracy, including citizens' assemblies, has led the world. I mean, we have some of the best practitioners, the best scholars of this, and perhaps are more often used overseas than they are here.
Thank you. Look, I think the panel discussion has been great. I thought their speeches were wonderful. I do want to come back to a point that both Nick and Leila mentioned, and Deborah, I think, highlighted in the session before. And it actually goes back to a Royal Society function we recently hosted with Ken Henry, who was, of course, a colleague of Peter and Hugh and myself, as Secretary of Treasury. And he argued very forcefully, and I'd never quite contemplated it, that the growing inequality in Australia at the moment is between generations. And it helps to explain the growing hostility towards the boomer generation. It is a significant issue and helps to, I think, explain this concern about the strength of democracy. The second thing is I did spend 20 years in the public service. Most of my time was trying to invent acronyms that no citizens could understand. I do think, Jeni, the Office of Community Cohesion gives me my chance, just make it the Office of Community Cohesion Australia and you can become OCA. So thank you, and we will now head for lunch.